We're actually starting to broadcast now. And you ready? You switch to
Hello, and on behalf of Kosmos Journal and Kosmos Community, welcome. I'm Lena Blunt. I'll be the moderator for today's panel discussion about activism in the new climate. Today's panel will be in 3 parts, and there will be time for questions at the end. So if you're watching live, feel free to submit questions in that chat panel, and we'll try to get to those at the close. But first of all, we need to start with what is the new climate, or even, what does activism mean? So each of us will have some different definitions of that. And I know for myself, activism has been a very rich part of my life. I've worked primarily on direct action campaigns around environmental issues, economic justice issues. And to me, activism is really when people join together to activate their inherent power to create a more just world. So it's really about putting values and beliefs into behavior and strategic thinking. And I think this is a really rich conversation to have right now in this new climate, which is everything that is urgent and everything that's an opportunity about the time in which we find ourselves. Explicitly, I think right now there are some very urgent needs to act on climate change. And to act against the growing and emboldened powers of xenophobia, racism, and hate in the US and around the world. So we're going to start by asking all of our panelists the question about how they see their own activism or activism in general evolving in 2017. We're going to give each person a few minutes to respond and tell us a bit more about their work. First, would love to have Jody Evans start. Jody is the co-founder and co-director of Code Pink and has been a peace, environmental, women's rights, and social justice activist for 40 years. Jody, how do you see your own activism and the strategy at Code Pink changing, if at all, under President-elect Donald Trump as he takes office in the next couple weeks?
Well, you asked me this on a day when we just disrupted the Sessions hearing, a racist who is being suggested for Attorney General. So literally, we have not changed from the first day we started. One of the Code Pink members laughed when he said he supported civil rights and was arrested. And the first day of Code Pink, Medea laughed and was arrested. So no laughing, just voting against women's rights is allowed in the Senate. But for all these years, as we've been doing our work to end war, about a year ago, I realized that it's not ending war because war is serving the war economy. It's shifting the war economy to a peace economy. And there is a peace economy. It already exists. It's the giving, sharing, caring, thriving, resilient, relational economy without which none of us would be alive. But there's this other economy of greed and power and destruction and extraction that captures our attention and our time and makes us feel that sense of alienation and scarcity when we live in a world of connection and abundance. So we flipped our mission upside down, which was to end war and bring the money home to the life-giving needs of our community. And now it is to grow the commitment to life and that serves life in our communities to bring the money home to end war. And it really starts with us divesting ourselves from the war economy and recognizing the patterns. We live in a culture of greed and violence, and recognizing where those are within us, and then working to divest ourselves. So for us, it's both to resist and to grow. This year, as we go to the inaugural to protest a racist, Islamophobist, misogynist taking the seat in the White House, our motto is to rise, love, and resist. And at Code Pink, we always do it as beautifully as possible. We say we make beautiful trouble. And our plan is to continue. And we're organizers. We feel everyone should be an activist. It's how we create the world, through our actions. The only recognizable feature of hope is action. So at Code Pink, we try to serve a community to help them be together in action, in effective action.
Excellent. Thank you, Jody. Jody is one of our 6 panelists today. And next, we'd love to hear from Martin Kirk. Martin is head of strategy for The Rules, a global network of activists, organizers, designers, researchers, and writers dedicated to changing the rules that create inequality and poverty around the world. He was also head of campaigns at Oxfam UK and head of global advocacy for Save the Children. Martin, what do you see when you look at this question of activism and change globally?
Oof, yes. Well, the first thing, we're all understandably and quite rightly focused on the immediate situation right now in the States and the Senate hearings, and but the perspective that I want to kind of bring to the fore really is how this is not an American problem. This is not a Trump problem. This is a system collapsing problem. And what we're seeing the same thing happening all over the world. So I think the challenge for us in this new environment is it's very hard to make the concept of global change, of global systems live in people's daily lives. It's so big and it's so conceptual and it's so grand, but we have to find ways of doing that and binding our movement globally, because what we're dealing with is a global system in crisis, which is spitting up these people like Donald Trump and Duterte in the Philippines and Temer in Brazil and all over the world. With Nigel Farage and Marine Le Pen, you can keep listing these people who are just riding the wave of this system in crisis. And so what we try to do with The Rules is to try to work to change the very deep logic in the stories that we all live within. Because we all make sense of the world through stories. That's how humans relate to each other, is through stories, and stories carry with them our understanding of how the world works. And our understanding of how the world works right now is being dictated to us and contained within a very small box that I love the way Judy actually spoke about it. The logic of greed and consumption and extraction, which is an anti-logic to the logic of life, to the logic of creation and life. And so what we need to do, and I'm actually quite hopeful in these moments of despair and these moments of crisis, because I think what's going to change for all of us this year, and hopefully it's going to be a sustainable change, is that in the face of these incredibly obvious violent men, and they're almost always men, who are being placed in positions of power right now, in the face of that, our sense of positive purpose is going to become so much stronger. And for years we've been saying, I'm sure everybody on the panel and anybody listening has been in rooms where they say, we've got to have a movement of movements, or we've got to connect climate struggle to this, and I think we've been living in spaces a little bit of luxury recently, where we've been coming at that in a way from a slightly overly cerebral place, rather than from a place of absolute necessity and drive. And I think perhaps this sense of crisis that is now, well, it's not just a sense, it's actual immediate political crisis that is facing us, is going to give us an incredible shot in the arm that's going to require us, not because we think it's a good idea theoretically or because we started to see the systems, but because we absolutely know that the time is right now. This is both a time of crisis, and the scale of the crisis is matched only by the scale of the opportunity it provides. So I think we're going to be finding ourselves in the common purpose between us is going to become so much more visceral, so much more driving, and out of that common purpose, miracles will emerge. A new story is going, it's sitting, as Arundhati Roy says, you can hear the new world, I can hear her breathing. I can hear the new world breathing. And I think we are going to hear her breath stronger and stronger as this year goes on. So actually, I'm really I have moments of despair, and I can see the tragedy coming, and I can see the violence, and I can see the dark side of what's happening. But the dark side is matched by a light side. They live together. And our job as activists, I think, in this new reality is to focus on bringing the light to the fore and not succumbing, not being forced into a new era of hate and fear in the face of these tyrants, but actually rise up to the challenge.
Thank you. Thank you, Martin. Next, we're going to go to Valerie Brown. Valerie is an ordained student of Zen Master Thich Nhat Hanh. She transformed her high-pressure career as a lawyer lobbyist to focus on human-scale work with individuals and groups to foster trustworthy and authentic connection. She's the co-author of The Mindful School Leader, Practices to Transform Your Leadership in School, named one of the best books on courage in 2014 by the Center for Courage and Renewal. Valerie, in your own practice, how do you respond to the changing conditions at this time, politically for women and other disenfranchised communities, but also for the Earth itself in the light of climate chaos?
So thank you for the question. I want to riff off a little bit of what both Jody and Martin have said so beautifully, and begin by lifting up a story, and a story starting very close in with my own life. As Martin said, stories matter. And so just a tiny little bit of background. I studied political science in graduate school. In undergraduate school, I studied political activism and political theory. And most of my working adult life has been as a lawyer and a lobbyist, representing what I guess would be perceived as very powerful groups, other lawyers and judges, college presidents, nonprofit organizations, educational institutions. And all that time, I don't know that I saw myself as an activist. I really saw myself more as a person who is a mediator, someone who is an advocate. And I see activism very much in that way, as someone who brings or encourages disparate groups to come together. I mean, that is the job of a lobbyist, to be a sort of a go-between warring parties people that don't talk to each other very often. And so I see I've seen my work as advocating, and in terms of bringing my voice into the mix of things, our voice into the mix of things. I'd also say that there's a part of me that says activism sounds very high and mighty. It almost sounds immodest. But the truth is, for me, and maybe for many other people, that activism is a job that we all have a responsibility to do. So how I speak is an activist act. How I listen is activism. What I buy is an activist act. Where I live is activism. I want to also lift up the words of Wendell Berry, who said, eating is an agricultural act. And so activism is a job, it's a responsibility of us all. And it's one that we do with a sense of courage and fierce open-heartedness and a quality of love. And I believe that our deepest calling as activists is not to conform to an idea of what we should be doing or what we should be saying, or an image that we should have of ourselves, but to be that most authentic voice that we can.
Thank you so much, Valerie. Next, Leslie Davenport is the author of Emotional Resiliency in the Era of Climate Change and is faculty at the California Institute of Integral Studies and JFK University. Leslie, kind of riffing on this, this question of activism, as a psychotherapist, what do you see is psychology's role in effective activism?
Yes, thank you. And I feel so aligned already with what's been expressed. What I'd like to do is name a few of the core pillars that live at the heart of psychology, and you'll hear that they've already been infused with what other people are sharing. So it really feels like psychology can support whatever direction activism may take. So for example, and I'll just ask as I go through a few points, kind of how does it bounce off your own personal experience with climate change work or with activism? So for example, psychology is all about supporting behavior change from things that are dysfunctional to a healthier, more fulfilling life, one that's in harmony. It's about best communication. What are the most effective ways for individuals, groups, communities to communicate with each other, including very respectful, deep listening, understanding around diversity issues? How can we break through denial around things that are so hard for us to look at? And I really think one of the big issues there is for a lot of people, you know, Martin was talking about this mounting crisis that we all feel, but not everyone is equipped with the tools to rise up to that. Instead, if it feels overwhelming, if they feel powerless, if their depression or anxiety gets bigger than their ability to rise up, there's a need for tools and for support and for ways of coming together around that. There's a lot of tools within the mental health field that cultivate empathy and compassion. Support around big change, especially when it's coming fast. How do you resolve trauma and not sink into it? Hopelessness, anxiety, depression. So a lot of understanding about grief and loss. And again, how to honor that and still move through that. And how can that actually build our resiliency to rise up, stand up, speak up in whatever ways we find our avenues in life to do so. A lot about narratives, inner narratives, as well as the external narratives that we tell, the stories we tell, and how are those integrated? How can individuals recognize their own gifts and strengths and find those, as Valerie was saying, day-to-day ways of bringing our own gifts? We don't have to be somebody else. What are the communities we're already plugged into that we can provide leadership, guidance, whatever it may be, and feel, you know, let go of those beliefs that hold us back. I don't have enough to offer. I'm not prepared. I don't have the right kind of training. And certainly, and I hope, you know, we'll talk about this more later, is the, you know, again, pointing to the resiliency underneath all of this, that the times are escalating, the challenges are getting bigger. And I think we need to not only utilize the resiliency tools that are well established, but how to dig even deeper into being grounded in our own sense of presence and courage in the face of all that's unfolding.
Thank you, Leslie. Maybe transitioning straight from courage, I'd like to go to Juan Orozco. Juan joins us from Mexico, where he studied philosophy and social sciences at the Jesuit University in Guadalajara. He's been a part of the hashtag Yo Soy 132 movement, working with immigrant Mixtec communities in Guadalajara, and now works especially with young people trying to build alternatives in a more rural context with a crisis of the future mainly ruled by the oil industry, the neoliberal electoral politics, and agribusiness there. So Juan, please tell us a little bit more about your work and how you see it changing and what you see happening in 2017.
Hi. Well, I try to work with communities in Tabasco, in a southern east state in Mexico, trying to build the real alternatives to the future we can see. So that places in a special situation when we think about Tabasco flooding if the temperature of the planet keeps rising. And we also are trying to figure out how to live decently and with dignity without this melancholia of the things that were promised by the oil industry and the development and these things. So yeah, in that way, I think that activism is about being honest on what affects us as a collectivity and how can we respond with what we are and with what we know, and not just as a professional job for social change. I mean, yeah, I think, as Valerie said, authenticity is just to recognize that we all are involved with each other, that we are part of a big system of relations that doesn't stop in our present, but it goes to our past, and from what we do now, we will start building the future that we possibly want or can achieve. And yeah, in general, I think that's what I can share by now.
Thank you. Thank you, Juan. We have one more panelist to introduce you all to. Sean Chamberlain is joining us from the UK. Sean is deeply involved with the Transition Town movement as an author and activist. He's also an editor of the late David Fleming's work, including Surviving the Future. He has a website, darkoptimism.org. And Sean, sort of closing out with you, is the outlook for activists dark or optimistic?
Well, it's interesting. I'm not always a fan of the term activism, because I always see in the media it's always activists did this and activists blocked that and activists opposed that. And I always think that's an interesting frame. It sounds like these crazy radicals. It's not like mothers did that or residents of the local area did that. So I'm always wary, like Jodie and Valerie were saying, actually, activism is this word that has a lot of associations, but some of them are positive and some of them are negative. But ultimately, as they were saying, it's very much about how we live our lives. It's, you know, people used to talk about people who go to church on Sunday but spend the rest of their time doing all these terrible, sinful things. And I feel a bit like that with people who spend their weekends preaching on social media but not actually doing anything in their real life. And I was put in mind of another line by Wendell Berry. He said that protest that endures, I think, is moved by a hope far more modest than that of public success, namely the hope of preserving qualities in one's own heart and spirit that would be destroyed by acquiescence. And that's sort of carved on my soul, I think. I think life is for telling a story that we believe in. And to echo what Juan was just saying, in the immortal words of Saul Williams, I can be all I can be and do much more than I'm paid to. And I think maybe that's what activism is about, is rediscovering in this context that Martin was talking about of system collapse of the mainstream economy and the mainstream culture increasingly failing to support us. This kind of market economy has only really been around for the past couple of 100 years. Before that, we didn't have this notion that the primary thing we should rely on to sustain us in our lives was money. And when we were asked, what do you do? It didn't mean, how do you sell your time to get the money you need to earn the right to exist? But much more, you know, what story do you want to tell with your life? As you mentioned, I've just recently published this book by my late friend and colleague, David Fleming, which is called Surviving the Future, Culture, Carnival and Capital in the Aftermath of the Market Economy, what Jody might call the war economy. And yeah, I think as Martin was saying, we look around us at this system crumbling, and it really does lead to a stepping up, because it ceases to be this intellectual thing, but it's actually, well, how do I support myself? How do I support my family? Importantly, how do I support my community? And how do we build ways of relying on people and on each other and on our communities, rather than relying on money, with all the kind of dangerous implications that brings in terms of giving up our authority, because ultimately we have to do what someone else tells us to do, because they'll pay us and we have to get the money. But yeah, to echo what Martin was saying, you know, times like these bring real fear and real uncertainty, but also the same forces that have cocooned us are the forces that have constrained us in many ways, and that often things that we used to think we couldn't possibly get away with, we couldn't possibly do, when you start telling the story that you really believe in, it's very interesting how often you find out that, you know, actually there's no one sitting behind that security camera or whatever it may be, because the system that's trying to keep us in line is itself struggling. And so we need to rebuild and replace the kind of atrophied social structures and ecological structures on which most kind of human cultures were built, because that's what we're going to need to have as the basis for a nourishing, cohesive society that can support us and can survive in the turbulent times to come. So yeah, like I think most of the others here, I'm quite hopeful, and this is why my work goes under this name of dark optimism, because bright shiny optimism just annoys me, to be honest, because I'm like, well, everything isn't fine actually, you know, there are some serious problems here, but nonetheless, in these times, or in any times, you know, even in times like these where there is undoubted darkness, there are always beautiful, meaningful stories to tell with our lives in that way that Wendell Berry talks about. And really, there's nothing more we can ask from life than that. You know, life is not about sustainability. Ultimately, we're all going to die, and the important thing is to do something meaningful and worthwhile while we're here.
Well, I think we can all certainly agree on that. Thank you to all 6 of our panelists for answering those questions. That's the end of our first part of this panel today. We're going to transition into the second part, really give each other a chance to have some conversations. So we've paired off our panelists into 3 pairs, and each pair sort of has a different focus. We'll be mostly conversing with each other, with some questions from me, some guidance from me through this section. And again, to our viewers watching live, we will be collecting questions throughout, and we'll respond to those in the third part to follow. So please keep submitting those as you're listening and as they arise. I'm going to keep Sean in the hot seat a little bit and invite Leslie to join him. Both of you have spoken a bit about resilience, either sort of indirectly as necessary in this moment of dark optimism, or directly as, you know, personal practice. But what really does resilience mean to you, and how do you think it manifests in our social change work?
You want to start, Liz?
Sure, I'll jump in there. Well, in the same way that the conversation has been broadening and expanding the definition of what activism is, I feel that the same is true with resiliency. You know, some of the more classical ways have to do with grounding, centering, even meditative techniques, which I love, and I think we'll have a chance to even do a little bit of that later on. But it's also very individual, and I know, Sean, you and I both have that shared experience of being dancers, and that is one of the wonderful ways to kind of reconnect with joy and with myself and get back in my body and feel a kind of creative freedom and playfulness, which to me is not moving away from this work, but it's how to stay present in it, because it is, as has been already expressed includes joy and connecting with that deeper sense of life, and in whatever ways we can open to that. And for me, the arts have always been one of those ways. It is part of the resiliency practice.
Well, yeah, I mean, on a personal level, 2 or 3 years ago, I burned out quite badly. And again, I wouldn't really draw a line between activism and work and life, but certainly, I suppose that in itself can be a dangerous attitude when you feel like things are sort of spinning out of control. And there's an amazing place, a project in Catalonia called Ecodharma. They ran a retreat, or they do run a retreat there called Sustaining Resistance and Empowering Renewal. And that was a really transformative experience for me. And I think, one of the things I really learned there was, the value to take the space that I need for those kind of, for dancing and for the cultural things that support me, and for spending time with my friends, for playing football like I'll be doing later. And learning how to say no in support of that, actually, to recognize that, it's okay. And I had a very powerful experience, actually, when I was with some activist friends at an Earth First gathering, and someone came to me and said, oh, I could really use your help with this and that and the other thing. And I said, and I'd never really done this before, so it was actually quite scary. I said to her, actually, I don't think I'm gonna do that, because I'm already as busy as I want to be, and that would just kind of take me over that. And I was sort of almost cringing from what the response might be, and thinking how annoyed she'd be that she had to take all this on. And in fact, she said, thank you. She said, wow, I really needed someone to model that for me. That's so helpful. And it was just such a surprise to me to have that reaction, that it was actually an incredibly valuable experience for both of us to kind of learn that. And at the moment, I mean, the last few years for me have been super busy with these books and publishing those. And I'm running a course at Schumacher College in a month's time around, how we live in this new climate. But very carefully have retained the time after that for a phase of slowing down and reflecting and reading and dancing, and not feeling like I have to always be flat out, because I know that if I do that, I quite quickly end up flat out on my back.
Yes, one of the ways I'm hearing what you're describing that I run into, that, for example, in therapy work, that when I'm working with individuals, is where is that elusive sense of enough? What's enough? How, not only how are we enough, but where is that edge where, because it can often feel like we're never doing enough. These issues are so big. It's hard to stop. And I think what you're saying is absolutely essential. And in a way, it's rooted in our, in the model of nature, right? It's the turning of the seasons, when things are in full bloom and when things recede. It's with our breath. We need to breathe in and breathe out. It's reflected in the rhythm of the tides and the turning of the moon. And I think to align with that is so essential to what we're talking about. It's another way of integrating into our place in this beautiful world.
Absolutely. Although I think, to avoid that sounding glib in the company of committed activists, we have to acknowledge the real tension that, I mean, one aspect of the new climate that I'm very aware of is climate change, and the fact that, it's not hard to make a case now that potentially we've actually lost that fight, that we are actually into runaway climate change. And, I'm not saying that's a definite fact, but it's something that I certainly felt over the last 10 years. Wow, this is our one chance. Previous generations didn't really know what we were doing, and future generations, it'll all be too late. So this is, the one chance we've got. And with that kind of pressure, and, there are equivalently urgent things happening in all the fields that all of us work in. It's very easy for it to sound like, oh yeah, sure, we need to take breaks, but not right now, and I think, one quote that I always come back to myself, I don't know why my head holds these quotes, but they just go in and stick. But what my favorite, probably because I have to remind myself of it so often, is by a theologian called Howard Thurman, who said, don't ask what the world needs, ask what makes you come alive. Because what the world needs is people who've come alive. And I remind myself of that so often, because I don't think I'm smart enough to figure out what the world needs. But there's something very wise in our soul that tells us what makes us come alive. And actually, when we're coming from that sense of full aliveness and joy, then the impacts we have in the world are way different and way more wonderful than we could ever anticipate. And we need to kind of get out of our brains a bit and hear our hearts and our souls, and dancing and art can really help to do that.
Oh, so much so. In fact, that's you know, this ways of knowing, ways of perceiving is, you know, part of what we're talking about, and the way in that, you know, it's been suggested the contemplative models that have such a role to play of not just our rational mind and figuring it out, but how can we tap into those places where we're surprised by the insight that might bubble up from a different place. And yeah, I think it's essential, because it's that overthinking mind that has gotten us into some of this mess, and that is part of the coming back into balance.
Yeah, I'd like to take resilience a slightly different direction, because we've spoken a bit about the system collapse, the growing xenophobia and hate that we're seeing around the world. And what does resilience mean to you in relationship to increasing hate between groups, between people? How do you bring resilience into a community framework as you do this work?
Do you want to start, or shall I?
Go ahead.
Okay, so resilience in the community frame. I mean, I think, you know, here in the UK, a really big thing that's been going on recently has been this Brexit. And we had this vote that pretty much split our country down the middle, you would say, in terms of the polls. You know, it was, I think, 52% to 48%. But that narrative has come through in the media time and again, like, oh, we're this divided nation, we've got nothing in common with each other, here are these two completely separate tribes. And that's an incredibly dangerous thing, because actually, when we talk to each other, we find that we've got a lot of the same concerns and a lot of the same issues, and that, you know, if you reduce any complex issue like that to yes or no, then the idea that anyone's going to feel completely at home with either side of that is ridiculous. And that, in a way, sort of putting it that way makes it really obvious that the thing that we're missing is listening. And the most beautiful response that I saw to the Brexit thing was, I think, 3 days after the Brexit vote, when a lot of people were in complete shock. There's a Quaker church in central London called St Ethelburgers, and they ran this open listening day, where, based on the Quaker model, people could just come and hear what other people said, and there was no responding, so there was no debating or arguing. It was just people going and saying what they felt in that context. And I thought that was such a powerful response at the community level. And it's, I think, creating those kind of spaces where people can hear in an open-hearted way and remember their common humanity can make such a difference in so many conflicts and areas of lack of understanding.
Sorry, I asked that question as you were running out of time. We're going to have to wrap up that pair and move on to our second pair, Martin and Juan. But I trust this theme will continue, you know, how resilience shows up in our work, between each other, within ourselves. Martin and Juan, though, you both have a particular sort of system level perspective, global perspective on these issues. You both work on land usage rights, excuse me. And the global climate, I think, on these issues is particularly pressing, and I trust you both can elaborate on that. But Martin, I suppose I'll push it to you next. What does this global crisis look like, and how does resilience play in to your work as well? And invite you to.
Yes. Okay. So, well, I thought, you know, I thought the way maybe we could talk about this, we could do a little bit of answering that question, and then take it down to look at how the crisis is really playing out right now in Mexico, and we can. Juan's got a fascinating perspective, and then take it down into community from there, the community resilience. So we've got a little 3-step thing we thought we might do. I think there's not too much to. I don't want to say too much about what it looks like globally, because I think that I think everybody is basically aware. I think lots of people feel right now in America, for example, where I am. I'm actually live in Colorado, but in New York right now, the sense of crisis, the sense of especially obviously among progressives, is clear, and everybody has a visceral sense of the crisis in Latin America in a way that, you know, even if Hillary had won, we probably wouldn't have this sense to work with now. And I think that same sense is existing in Britain because of Brexit. I think it's the same sense existing in Brazil, same sense existing in South Africa, in the Philippines. So all over the world, people are feeling this, even if they can't put lots of words and certainly not a technical breakdown of exactly which thing is happening, exactly how the machinery is breaking down. The visceral sense that something is very, very deeply and seriously wrong is pervasive around the world. So I would say this is where we can start thinking about this. This is where our opportunity lies. Unfortunately, in this pain of the sense of crisis, because I think what we're seeing is one system starting to take over. And if I'll just go to Juan now, because say right now there's a severe social unrest going on in Mexico. Get Juan to explain what that is, but what I'd like us to think about as we hear Juan describing this is to think of this is like if we think of an ocean, this is the wave right now in Mexico. This is the symptom that we are seeing of system-shaken collapse in Mexico right now. But there will be another one after this one, and there will be another one after that one. So we don't want to get too caught up on any individual example, but it is really important to see the different ways this plays out. So I'm getting some messages here that my audio isn't great. I hope you can basically follow me. Maybe the best thing, and let me just switch to Juan, whose audio will be great. Juan, tell us what's happening. What's the crisis? What's the surface of the crisis looking like right now in Mexico?
Well, I think that first of all, the crisis is about a state based on oil. And when you quit subsidies from gasoline, diesel fuels, and that increases the price of gasoline fuel based life, it makes anger, it boosts anger. And we have to say that the anger doesn't come only from the oil, the raise of the gasoline prices, which is from 15 to 20% from one day to another, but from also a neoliberal way to rule, or to try to rule a state. So what we are seeing right now is people that's angry because fuel is going to be more expensive, not because that is going to cause every other price, for example, of food or of electricity to rise, but because the rise of the fuels prices. That makes us think that we don't have the tools to walk towards another way of life that is more sustainable, and the way of responding is with anger and with panic. So that makes the crisis like more and more difficult to overcome.
And did you? There's also been some stories going around that the government has actually been they pulled off the subsidies overnight, raised prices between 13% and 30%, like that, and which obviously caused social unrest. And they've been stoking that unrest because unrest gives them the opportunity. If there's the greater the unrest, the more justification they can provide to do a very kind of crackdown response. So causing the pain, they're causing more of the pain so that they can then crack down on the response. And this is the sort of logic that we're in now with this system. It's at this point, it's at a point of desperation, where it knows that it is in some sort of collapse spiral or in some sort of crisis. And so the response, so you get publics electing people like Donald Trump and Brexit in moments of desperation, and you have governments acting in desperation, desperately trying to hold on to what is clearly a shaking, dying system. So Juan, how is your community, what is your community response? What is, when you spoke earlier about literally building, physically building the things for the transition, the bridge into a different way of life. Can you say just a couple of things about what that means in kind of really practical terms?
Well, we are trying to make some work alternatives, not job alternatives. I mean, we are not looking for salaries or positions in enterprises or something like that. We are trying to create the ways to provide us with what we need to live well. And one of that ways, one way we are trying to start is we call it the Peasant's Life School, Escuela de Vida Campesina, and we're trying to learn how to work the soil with agroecology to face our needs and the crisis we are facing in this new climate we are experiencing. And agroecology has a lot of ways to help us to face this with biodiversity and a lot of other things to cool the planet and to feed us. That's what excellent. We are trying to do.
Yeah, thank you so much, Juan. I really appreciate bringing down to really a tangible sort of case study level what some meaningful alternatives are to this gasping system in which we find ourselves in. So thank you both for really elaborating on that example and case in Mexico. Certainly thank you, Juan, for your work there. We're going to transition to our last pair for this section, which will be Jody and Valerie. Now, I have a lot of different places I want to start with the two of you. I know you're both longtime practitioners of sort of personal practice as well as organizational work. And so I guess I'd sort of like to start at that question around the internal work and the external work. And as we look ahead to the next year, or just for yourselves personally in your work now, how the dynamic between the internal and the external is manifesting.
Jody, do you want to lead us off?
Well, since you're talking about the internal, I thought probably you should.
Okay. So this is it's a great question, and it's an important point, and it feels like a red thread that's really been a continuum throughout this conversation. And so my sense is that we as activists, we as people, that we have a lot of work to do ahead of us. And that means that we need to prioritize our own self-care. And very, very often we're looking for these sort of external validations. I know that was certainly part of my life story. And I think it's important to say that, you know, we are deeply conditioned. We've got a lot of scar tissue built up. And as Ram Dass said, we're conditioned into becoming somebody. And for me, it was the role of the lawyer. It could be the role of the doctor. It could be the role of the activist, whatever that role is. But we learn very early on, maybe at the age of 2 or 3, that it's not safe to be who we deeply are. So all of this conditioning is like a scar tissue. And the work is really about risking our own growth over the security of whatever the status or the role is that we have adopted for ourselves. So I'll just stop there.
Thanks. So for, when I talked about growing a local peace economy, that riffs off of what you're talking about, in the sense that, as we heard earlier, we tend to want to solve the bigger problems, the world problems, instead of just be in relationship with what's happening right here, right now in our own communities, and in bringing ourselves back to where we live, what we're connected to, and the commitment to create conditions conducive for life. That grounds us in the value base that is an internal drive instead of an external drive. And it's been said that movements are value-based and organizations are transactional-based. And at this time when we're calling on, and Sean talked about that, the movement of movements or whatever it is, it's not an external thing. It's an internal commitment to values. And when I looked out at the world and I saw global climate change, inequality, $1.4 trillion worth of weapons sold last year, the only historical answer was fascism. And I found myself closed down. And then all of a sudden I felt like water on my knee and I went, oh, it's a flood. And when you believe in life, you build an ark. And for me, building a local growing my local peace economy is that arc, is the thing when you believe in life that will get you through. But that means you need to take your sight here, now, where you live, learning about those that are affected by the extractive economy and being in relationship with.
So I want to pick up on that point with a quote from Audre Lorde, who said that caring for myself is not self-indulgence. It is an act of self-preservation, and that is an act of political warfare. Really, what we're talking about, to do the kind of work that Jodi's or any of us is talking about, we need to be good stewards of the resources that we have. And if we want to be an environmental activist, as Juan is talking about, if we want to be a community activist, then it starts at the root. It starts by coming back home to ourselves. I'll just share a quick story. A few years ago, I led a retreat for a group of community activists, and part of the retreat involved eating in a mindful way, really tasting the food, and actually having food that was cooked and sitting down to eat that. Well, this one woman said this was the first time that she was gentle with her food. And I really took that to heart. And it may sound self-evident and simple, but I see this as an imperative. This is a daily discipline. It's very unsexy, but it's these disciplines, these habits they not only support us in body, mind, and spirit, but they help us to do the work that then supports so many other people. And what we're talking about is very simple things, like when you getting a glass of water and drinking a glass of water, using the facility, standing up from one's desk, sitting down, laying down. These are very, very simple things.
Well, I'd like to riff off that, because there's also, in creating and growing your local peace economy, there are practices that we need to unhook ourselves from the culture we've lived in and the ways that we don't realize we're participating in the war economy. And that those practices, we need each other, because of that sense of not being able to see ourselves, and the ways that what is in our mind we think is what's real instead of what is in our behaviors, and having someone mirror that back. And so at Code Pink, we come together and try to build our local peace economy. And the first step is in reaching out to 8 neighbors. You know, if we're going to grow a movement for peace, then we have to be related to those near us. And what that is to listen and be related to other, and to witness our own, where we get caught and where our heart shuts down, and what those responses look like in a loving, generous way, both with ourselves and with the other, and be committed together to something, to go adventure into the community and find what in our heart, you know, as Sean mentioned, what is the thing that makes us come alive in our own community is the thing that's going to bring life to that community. And the more we're in relationship with that which is abundant and that which is generous, the more we will be attracted to that, and the more it becomes part of our lives. And then the more attractive it becomes to others, and how that grows. But you know, as Valerie said, it's a slow start and it feels boring. We're used, you know, we are addicted to the big and the powerful and the loud. And I want to turn the pyramid upside down. So, because we all get so attracted to the thing on the top,
Right.
But what is life is all of us that create the base.
Thank you so much, both of you. Sort of implicit, I think, in what you were saying about what gives us life is that sort of real joy, that piece of energy that enlivens our work, that gives us that internal motivation. And I just sort of want to continue with that joy piece. And I know, Leslie, you said you had a practice, and you'd like to sort of introduce us to for how we can really bring that type of thinking into personal meditation.
Great. Yes, I'm going to take not more than 5 minutes at the most with describing a practice. If you'd like to, you can kind of follow along and do a mini version of it, but it's the kind of thing that could easily expand into 10 or 20 minutes. And I suspect that many of you already do a version of this, so it may seem very familiar. So the first thing is to either allow your eyes to have a soft focus or to let them close, and to just recognize for a moment that this particular moment in time has never been experienced before. That if we release thoughts about the past, about the future, it really is arising in an unmarked way. And then to bring attention to the breath and begin to breathe into that sense of openness, the unmarked quality, the freshness of this moment, and to allow it to become a part of the breath. And we know that the oxygen that we breathe travels to every single cell in the body, so we also invite that open, spacious quality to be a physical, visceral experience. And this is not just imagining or thinking about that, but to feeling into the soles of our feet, noticing any sensations, to our calves, knees, thighs, right leg and left leg. And notice any support, literal support we're receiving from the floor, from the earth, from a chair. And adding awareness up through the torso, including the different vital organs that are supported by the oxygen of the in-breath, cleansed by the exhalation. Inhabiting ourselves through our neck, shoulders, upper back, and maybe even sensing the breath like an internal breeze that flows into our arms, hands, and fingers. So embodying more and more with awareness, adding our neck and throat, feeling a place for your voice, Noticing how your voice is poised between your heart and your mind. Allowing your jaw to be soft and loose. Allowing your face to feel free from the pressure of any expressions. Just a moment to rest. All the way to the top of your head until there's a three-dimensional experience of being present here, now, knowing the breath is connecting us to all of life back into our body. That ebb and that flow we talked about, the receiving and the releasing. And feeling that ancient rhythm like the ebb and flow of the tides. Like the turning of day and night. And that, in and of itself, very, very balancing. And then in the same way you're present and aware of your body, invite your mind and emotions to take a rest. Not forcing anything, not requiring anything, but the same kind of invitation you extended to your body. And then sensing even more deeply inside yourself that fundamental aliveness that we've spoken of, that vibrancy, that life force that animates your body, mind, emotions, and connects you again to all of life. And as you breathe into that, the way you might blow onto the embers of a campfire to help the flame strengthen, just breathe into your own essence, embodied, present, here and now. And then from this supported, connected with life, deep sense of self, you can then invite in front of you any concern, any distress, any pain, not to deny it, but to be able to be present with it, a conflict, a disappointment, a feeling of distress, making room for any and all emotional responses without losing your grounding in your own centered presence. And just take a moment to notice anything that arises. Perhaps a new way of seeing, perhaps a fresh response, perhaps a letting go. And that this practice can be done with anything, everything for clarity. So that's something you can just bring your focus now back in a way that you're comfortable opening your eyes, but staying connected to anything you found valuable or useful. And know that this kind of thing is always available.
Thank you so much, Leslie. And thank you to all of our pairs, all of the panelists for the rich conversations we've been having. We're sort of transitioning into our third and final section of the panel today. So for those of you watching at home, if you have a question that hasn't yet been addressed, please do feel free to submit it into the live chat, and we'll try to get to that as we close here. We'd like to transition now to some specific tools and some final statements from some of our panelists. So as we open that discussion to talk about specific tools, I'd like to share that Kosmos will soon be announcing a special initiative to advance a more intimate form of activism that we're calling the Power of Three. The Power of Three leverages the self-organizing power of people through groups of three to come together around a shared concern and a simple practical goal in order to take action together. So Kosmos will publish a framework for this new model and support Power of Three groups or triads with a handbook, editorial support, and even funding in some cases. So look for that more in the spring. It's the Power of Three. And then just would like to open it up to our speakers and panelists if there are any specific tools or closing comments. I know Martin you had some thoughts to wrap us up, and then perhaps Valerie as well.
Thank you. My thought, and this is such a difficult, I mean, this has been a lovely wide-ranging conversation. It's gone from the grand global down to the very intimate space of the individual internal, and that's wonderful. And I think this is exactly the sort of thing we need more of. We often, we're so used to kind of zero-sum thinking. It's and this or that, this and that. You do local or global. You do climate change or healthcare. You do this or that. And actually, we've really, this is one of the essential challenges of the moment, which is how to see beyond our individual concerns without surrendering them. And there are ways to do that. And I think one thing that we from the rules try to do, as you said, we try to take both the whole system, we try to take the whole system perspective and work with people like Juan, these phenomenal leaders on the ground who are doing this very local grassroots building work. And we try to encourage people to spend more time. There's a dearth right now. There's a lot of great work going on all over the world, but one thing we don't think there is enough of is enough people genuinely targeting in their local environment, in their national environment, those dynamics that are truly globally systemic. So if you could take something like the concept of GDP is the way we measure our economies. We need to be talking about those fundamental rules that apply everywhere. And we're not seeing, we need to own them. They apply to my economy as much as they apply to Brazil, or they apply to Uganda, or they apply to Nepal. And I need to change them in my environment, and I need to work with people who are changing them globally, because we are all fighting one enemy here. We're all trying to overcome the same system, and we have to figure out getting enough of our firepower, our attention being paid to those whole system dynamics, those things that you know, we often say this. We say the reason that food prices are rising in Nairobi is the same reason that your students in America are being crippled with debt, is the same reason that the rainforests in Indonesia are being cut down, is the same reason as, and you can list and list and list. It's all the same reasons. So we've got to encourage each other to see those things that bind and target our attention there. Right now, there is so much imperative to be focusing on what's immediately in front of us. Donald Trump, Brexit, the rise of Marine Le Pen. And these things, this is our trick, how to not stop that whilst at the same time not losing sight of the fact that we are all in the same basic system here. That's one of our challenges, and that's the one that I think we would really encourage people to try and move into that space and not get too caught up in the day-to-day drama, critically important though that is at the same time. So moving away from the zero-sum, one or the other, and trying to develop this, once we sometimes call constellational thinking that sees the whole without surrendering the part that we live in.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Valerie, do you have closing thoughts or tools for us?
Sure. You know, as Martin speaks, the word that comes to mind is a word by Thich Nhat Hanh, interbeing, and the interconnectedness of all things. I was at a retreat with Thich Nhat Hanh, and one of the wisest things I heard a monk say was that we're very good in the United States and elsewhere in the pursuit of happiness. We're not so good in generating happiness within ourselves, generating joy within ourselves. And so what I'd like to share is the practice of generating joy within ourselves. And this is an essential practice for every person, every being, actually. And this comes with a lot of science behind it in neuroplasticity. And it's what we already know. And that is very simple, 2 very simple steps. The first is to recognize that we have joyful experiences probably all day long. And on a continuum from, say, 0 to 10, these experiences may be a 1 or a 2, such as the steam rising from a cup of coffee, or your feet on a wooden floor. These are experiences all day long that are moments, a glimpse of happiness, but very often they're over our head. We are so focused on so many other things. We're in overwhelm, or whatever the case may be, quite distracted. And so the practice of bringing joy into one's life is simply to stop and to notice the experience, the positive experience, the good experience that you've had. And as Rick Hansen and many other neuroscientists have said, actually download that. So pause for 5 to 10 seconds, absorb it, download it, memorize that moment, embedded in our bones. And this is a way of capturing joy in our lives. I'll tell a very brief story that I led a retreat 2 weeks ago. I had a woman who was very, very distraught over all of the things that we have been talking about on this call. She went outside and at the end of the retreat, and she was just sitting and looking at the ground, and noticed there was moss. And she followed the moss with her eyes to a tiny, tiny little flower that was growing in the moss. And she came back and she shared that moment, and she said, that was a moment of joy. She got it, she downloaded it. And this is the practice, to download, to absorb these many, many moments of joy. We want to, if we want a joyful world, then the practice is to be joy, to generate joy.
Thank you so much, Valerie. Sean, do you have a closing statement or tools for us?
See, I've been trying to find something I disagreed with, because I always find, you know, you can often learn from the juicy bits of disagreement, but I've struggled to find much amongst present company. The only thing was when I think someone said that looking after ourselves and drinking water can sound very unsexy, but great sex can be a wonderful way of looking after ourselves as well, and hopefully that can bring a bit of sexiness into it. And but yeah, in general, I think, you know, we've all talked about how this mainstream economy is kind of crumbling and ceasing to sustain more and more of us. And you know, despite the ever-increasing cost of living, it does remain remarkably popular. So we're all looking for new stories to live by. And I think my work has always been about that, kind of what tools I can offer. So I was involved in the early days of getting the Transition Towns movement set up as a way of encouraging communities to work together, working with sort of moneylessness and that kind of work. And then agroecology that we've touched on through my work with the Ecological Land Cooperative, which sets up, makes it possible for ecological projects to access land in the UK. But just like Martin, I've found that I've increasingly been drawn to this kind of, how do we pull all this together and and kind of make sense of what we do collectively and the big picture. And absolutely the best thing I feel like I've done in my sort of 10 years of being full-time on activism is this book by my late mentor David Fleming that came out a few months ago, Surviving the Future, because it really does lay out that new story of an economy that's based in all the things that we're talking about. So that's definitely one tool I would offer. And I actually just today had a review of it, which is the best yet, which said if I had to pick only one book to save and pass along to future generations, this would be that book. And I don't think praise can get much higher than that, so I was pretty pleased with that. But I personally feel like it's been this huge amount of work to produce that. And now I'm really stepping into a kind of listening phase, rather than doing a lot of speaking and writing, but more taking a step back and moving more into community and more into hearing things and reading. And the other thing that I would offer as a tool in that respect is this course that I'm running with Rob Hopkins of Transition Towns and Mark Boyle, who's often known as the Moneyless Man. We're running this week-long course in a month's time, from the 6th to the 10th of February at Schumacher College in the UK, for anyone listening in the UK. And that's called Community Place to Play at Post-Market Economics. And that's very much going to be about, you know, sitting down for a week with a group of maybe 10 to 15 people and really figuring out, you know, what everything we've talked about looks like on a practical level. So it'd be great to see some people at that in a month's time. And also just I wanted to say thank you to everyone who's been on this call, because I feel like I feel like my family's grown, and there are a lot of people here who I didn't know before, and feel like could be allies for a long time to come. So thank you for making it happen.
Thank you, Sean. And I'd love to turn to you, Jody, as we wrap up here. You have so much experience in this work. What thoughts do you have for us as we close?
Well, I'm happy that we're talking so much about the economy. So the word divest came up. Watch yourself, watch your day. How much of your day do you invest in the war economy? How often do you feel alienation and scarcity? And that's the time to transform that into generosity and connection. And that means going out and doing something different. So just take a record of your day and watch what happens and see if you could get just to 50% that your day is spent in connecting and learning and being supportive. One of the things as an anti-war activist that really triggers me is when we say we need to be safe and secure, which is always the excuse to go to war. And instead, what we need to do is be supportive of each other. Imagine if we took the military budget of the United States of America, 51% of US taxes, and invested in those things that support conditions conducive to life, our clean water, our clean air. Imagine if we paid real price for the food that is grown for us. Imagine if we, separated food production into something that actually nourished the earth instead of violated the earth. So I feel that as soon as you connect, start divesting, and then connect to what is your growing local peace economy, it will bring you more joy, and it will also take away that kind of free-flying anxiety when we look out of the world of change, because it connects you. So stay connected.
Thank you so much. We did actually have a question come in, so I'll pose this to the whole panel, see if anyone has an answer or response. The question is, what can be offered to the angry and left behind people who have embraced Brexit and Trump? And that's the question.
Sean?
Mm-hmm. Sean.
Yeah, I mean, this is something that's come up a huge amount here. So I've been doing this tour around the books and in the immediate aftermath of the Brexit vote. And as I say, there's been this huge division and stereotyping. Like, everyone who voted to leave Europe was either an idiot or a racist, according to the media. And it's completely untrue. There are some very valid and powerful reasons why people might not want to be part of a very corporatist European Union, for example, or that they feel like their very identity as British or as English is being threatened by this EU. So firstly, the listening thing that we mentioned earlier, I think, is absolutely essential. But then also, as we heard before from Martin, I think a lot of the votes recently, Trump, but also Corbyn in the UK, a very left-wing, I think a lot of the big votes that we've seen, Brexit, have been a no. This system is not working for me. This globalized neoliberal system is a disaster. And there's a reason why we hear a lot about fascism, and that's because when Mussolini and Hitler came to power, they didn't just come to power on the basis of a sort of agenda of hatred and othering, but also they raised wages and they addressed unemployment and they improved working conditions. And I think what we absolutely have to do, and this is what a lot of people here have been talking about, is build an alternative vision of how we look after those desperate and dispossessed. Because if the only alternative that's presented to people is that rather despicable one, then it will win, because people are thoroughly sick of having their faces ground into the dirt. And so what we need is to build this beautiful vision, this alternative vision of a new kind of economy built on trust and on diversity and on loyalty. And I think that's what a lot of the work of the people on this call is all about.
I saw, Martin, your hand went up as well. Do you have something to add to that response?
Yes, just one quick point, which is, if we think they're angry now, wait 5 years. Because they are only going to get angrier as it becomes more and more apparent that they've been completely duped. Trump is not going to bring coal jobs back. He's not going to help the white working class. He's corporatizing the American government, corporatizing, militarizing the American government. Same is going to happen in Brexit. Same is going to, I mean, absolutely, the desperation and anger are going to rise in exactly the community we need, that we are currently actually stoking the anger in. Many people on the left are kind of stoking the anger and being judgmental about it and saying, there is an absolute need for us to figure out how to be compassionate with our activism and not become tribal and raise the barriers between us and them. It's as I say, now is the time to learn how to do this, because if we think it's bad now, we ain't seen nothing yet.
Jody, I saw your hand.
So yeah, I just also want to be careful that it's not about Trump and Brexit, that it's about the structure we live inside of, and that not to get too focused on them. But you know, we ain't seen nothing yet. You know, and it's, yes, they're kind of the thing that the structure has risen to the top. But you know, we have global climate change, we have all these weapons out there, and we have this level of inequality, and we have a technology out of control. You know, in the United States, I say that the curtains got pulled back on the Wizard of Oz, but they have not been pulled back very far, really. We haven't, you know, in the US, yeah, they got to see that the democracy never really existed and the structure's, you know, a swamp. But, you know, there is a global financial market that's level of inhumanity is not, it's going to be something people are going to have trouble bearing, that this is what they live on. It's bigger than a swamp, and it's even bigger than a war zone. And so we have ways to go that aren't really as much about Trump and Brexit, but about the systems that we've allowed to exist, and that it's inherent on us to wake up to that and then begin to behave, to separate ourselves out and build other structures.
Thank you so much. I think that's spot on, and a great wrap up for the whole panel. Obviously, part of answering these questions is going to be how we live our lives beyond this panel. So just an invitation to everyone to keep engaging in all of these levels of this work, and not just the either or thinking, but to dig in personally and in community to be resilient. I'd like to make a final invitation. This is the most recent edition of Kosmos Journal, which is published twice a year. Nancy Roof is the editor, as many of you know. She is an incredibly dedicated server to the Kosmos mission, which is the transformation in harmony with all life. So you can subscribe to the print and or digital version of the journal at kosmosjournal.org. That will automatically enroll you as a member of the Kosmos community, which means you'll receive Kosmos online every 2 weeks and invitations to special presentations like this one, and much more. So final invitation to join the Kosmos community, subscribe to Kosmos Journal, and just deep, deep gratitude to all of our panelists, to everyone watching live. Stay engaged. It's a conversation, and it will continue.
The graphic.